On September 3, 2020, Williams Grand Prix Engineering placed a notice in its corporate file with the British Companies House. It read, "Termination of appointment of Frank Owen Garbutt Williams as a director." This brief notice had a profound effect on Formula One. It marked the end of a career for Frank Williams, which spanned over 50 years in the sport, but it also marked the exit of Formula One's last true independent team. Today, we'll investigate the death of independent Formula One teams. In the early days of Formula One, the sport was quite different from what we see today, particularly in terms of the teams who were actually participating. During this time, Formula One was dominated by a mix of both factory teams and also independent privateer teams. The first official world championship for drivers was held in 1950, and the field was primarily composed of Italian teams like Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and Maserati. These teams were set up to dominate the early years due to their resources and experience. However, alongside these factory teams, there are a number of private cars and smaller independent teams that also took part in the races. For example, Scuderia Achillevazzi, who raced in the 1950 Formula One season with a supercharged Maserati 4C LT. The difference was they were an independent Argentine car club that simply bought a customer car and then raced in the big leagues. Alfa Romeo was particularly dominant in this period, winning almost every race in the 1950 season with their pre-war Alfetta 158s. Interestingly, races at this time also saw the participation of pre-war heroes like Rudolf Caracciola and Tazio Nuvolari, as well as rising stars such as Alberto Ascari and Juan Manuel Fangio. It's important to note, during this period there was a significant presence of privateer teams in Formula One. For instance, Rob Walker Racing Team was a notable privateer team that was responsible for the first victories in Formula One for both Cooper and Lotus. This period was marked by a greater freedom for constructors to sell their chassis to other teams, and this allowed privateer teams to compete more effectively and be more competitive. Brabham and Lotus chassis, for example, were extensively used by other teams during the 1960s and 1970s. It was an era characterized by a diversity of all teams, and every team had a hunger for innovation and racing. However, over time, the Formula One Championship would gradually change. By the 1970s, a significant shift had occurred from smaller independent teams merely purchasing cars from manufacturers to these teams becoming fully independent entities. A single individual entering their own customer car was now a thing of the past. This era marked the rise of independent teams like McLaren, Lotus, and Williams, who not only ran their operations independently, but also designed and built their own cars. This shift was facilitated by several factors, including changes in regulations, technological advancements, and an increased focus on innovation within the sport of Formula One. Teams like McLaren and Lotus were driven by visionary leaders like Bruce McLaren and Colin Chapman respectively. They pushed the boundaries of car design and engineering, leveraging innovative aerodynamics and chassis designs. Buying a customer car was no longer a true viable option. It still occurred with thinly disguised rebrands. However, it was much less common, especially if you wanted to be competitive. McLaren and Lotus in the 1970s should be distinguished from their modern-day counterparts. During this era, they operated with a spirit of independence, focusing on racing and innovation, rather than being extensions of large automotive brands.
We seem to manage to beat them all with, first of all, Lotus and then the Matra.
Their success in championships during this time highlighted the potential of independent teams to not only compete with, but also outperform the manufacturer teams. The McLaren team won the Constructors' Championship in 1974, 1984, 1985, 1988, 1989, and 1990, and are iconic for the rivalry between Senna and Prost. For more on this rivalry, you can watch my video on screen. Williams, founded by Frank Williams and Patrick Head, is another exemplary story of an independent team's rise. Starting in the 1970s, Williams evolved from a small independent outfit into a championship-winning team, paving the way for their dominance in the 1980s. They ended up winning 9 Constructors' Championships between 1980 and 1997, with the likes of Nigel Mansell and Graham Hill, among many other notable drivers. The contrast between this era and the corporate-driven F1 of today is stark. In the earlier days, the sport was more accessible to these truly independent teams, and there was a level of competitiveness that allowed these teams to thrive. In contrast, modern F1 is characterized by significant financial and technological investments from major manufacturers and investors, which has shifted the competitive landscape. Although McLaren and Williams are still in the sport today, they are a much different beast than that of yesteryear. Williams ended up selling out to Dorilton Capital, so whilst they're not a manufacturer team, as they get their engine from Mercedes, they're no longer a true independent team like they once were. Same with McLaren, once a team who focused solely on racing, now facing corporate ownership from Bahrain Mumtalakat Holding Company. Ron Dennis, former owner, CEO, chairman, and founder of McLaren Group, now has no affiliation with the team at all. Dennis was removed from his McLaren management roles in 2016 and was no longer a shareholder since June 2017. If we look at the stats from what I've dubbed the golden era, which is from 1970 to 2000 in Formula One for independent teams, there's some very interesting findings. Let's jump into it. So the first thing is, within this time, independent teams dominated. They won 23 Constructors' Championships, where manufacturer teams only won 8. This era was also marked by the success of teams like Williams, McLaren, and Lotus, who we've already mentioned, and they weren't tied to any major automotive brands at that time, and they were operating with a strong sense of independence. However, when we look at modern F1, think 2001 to 2023, we see a stark difference. By my definitions of a truly independent team, we see 0 championships won in the Constructors. Instead, we see 1 Constructors Championship won by an independent team, Brawn GP in 2009. And the reason I think that's only a half-half is because they took over the remnants of Honda. Red Bull was initially classified as an independent, but after considering the fact that they have the partnership with Honda and now Red Bull powertrains, I feel like they're more so a partnership team, more similar to a manufacturer team than they are to a similar independent team of the past. They won 6 championships during this time. Then when we look at the manufacturer teams, so we've got the Mercedes, the Ferrari, the Renaults of the world, they won a total of 16 championships. The evolution of Formula One in the new millennium has been marked by an unmistakable trend, the increasing dominance of those manufacturer teams. This shift can be traced back to the escalating costs of competing in the pinnacle of motorsport, where technological advancements and the necessity for substantial research and development resources have increasingly favoured larger, manufacturer-backed teams. The era that once celebrated the triumphs of independent teams like Williams and Sauber has seen those same teams become backmarkers, struggling to keep pace in a sport that now demands significant financial and technological investment, especially in the era prior to the cost cap. The creativity and competitiveness that the independent teams brought to the sport has left a lasting legacy on car designs, race strategies, and technological advancements. I mean, Williams were the ones to introduce active suspension and other innovations in the golden years. However, as the sport has evolved, these teams have found themselves facing insurmountable economic and technological barriers. This reality has helped reshape the competitive landscape of Formula One, signalling an end of an era where the small independent teams cannot effectively compete at the highest level. Looking at teams like Williams, they were once a powerhouse of innovation, and now they are backmarkers in the sport. They're under the control of Dorilton Capital, and the recent strong-arming of potential entrants like Andretti out of the sport entirely highlights the fact that F1 seems more concerned about the finances than they do about true racing and innovation. The question then arises, what does the future hold for Formula One and these independent teams? With the introduction of the cost caps, there's a glimmer of hope that the independent teams we see today, of course not exactly like they were in the past, but the likes of the Williams and the Saubers, that they can come back and fight with those up front. I'd love to see an underdog story of Williams coming back and fighting for the Constructors' Championship, but even with these cost caps in place, it doesn't seem like they can catch up to the infrastructure that the likes of Red Bull, Mercedes and Ferrari have. Now these are just my thoughts on the current trends of F1 in recent times. I'd love to know what your thoughts are down below. Ultimately, I just don't want F1 to lose its spark entirely. In an over-corporatized world, F1 seems to be making moves solely to protect their financial metrics, rather than the sport itself. An 11th team with Andretti, and seeing actual passion for the sport from the current independent teams, such as Haas, would be perfect. I'm sick of seeing backmarker teams happy at the back of the grid. That's all for this one. If you do want to support the channel, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It would surely help. And if you want more of F1's past, watch my video on the Ferrari 412 T2, which will be on screen now.